Rightio, next up, we have a small gregarious mammal, also known as Chris Ward, or possibly Chris Chinchilla. He's a freelance technical writer based in Berlin, who's also come out all the way over here, although he once upon a time did call Melbourne home. He's worked on some local Melbourne icons. He's worked on content for the Triple J Unearthed website and for Ceres, the environmental farm up in the north half of Melbourne. He seems to be one of these people who likes writing about everything that's going. So I've Internet of Things, security, PagerDuty, looking after the HugOps people. He's written lifestyle articles for Envato, another Melbourne icon, the Cult of Mac, and more in his free time, because I don't know how he's got free time. Guitarist, he speaks French and German. He's a man of projects and crazy ideas, and he strikes me as a bit of a passionate creative with a vision for a better world through connecting people. Here's Chris.
And now I'll disappoint you after that amazing. So this is possibly a slightly different topic from some of the other talks here. It's possibly more introducing you to an area of writing that maybe you hadn't thought about yet. And it's conversational UIs. And this will sort of I'll be loosely grouping together things like voice interfaces, like I'm assuming no one has an Alexa in this room, so I can say the word without setting it off. But things like Alexa, Google Home, Siri, etc. These sorts of interfaces, but also chatbots. So bots that you sometimes will talk to in various messaging platforms. And they have some slightly different ways you deal with them, but there's enough crossover that I can sort of bundle it together into one presentation. And I guess for me, why I'm interested in this topic is because I feel like it's one of these areas of technology that when we've sort of nailed it and got it right will be really interesting and kind of change the way that we interact with the world around us. So just trying to find my mouse pointer for a second. Where are you? Okay. So I do a bunch of tech journalism as well as kind of documentation writing. And this year I've actually been to quite a few events and conferences on chatbots and voice interfaces. And over again, in pretty much every presentation I've been to, I've heard we need good writing. It's all words. Whether it's a voice interface or a chat interface, it's all mostly involving words. So they need good words, and they need appropriate words for them. So actually, for anyone in this room who's a passionate writer but would like to do something a bit different, then it's actually a great kind of space to be looking at. And so in this presentation, I kind of want to go through a few tips that I've picked up from these events that you can play around with to maybe get involved in the space. And the first thing, Tacky Animation, this is going to be an interactive presentation. It's about conversations, so we need to have a conversation to test some of these. Before I get into the tips, let's have a look at why we might want to be doing this as well. So it's still early days, but this is messaging applications, the red line. Messaging application usage has now overtaken social networking application usage. Not every messaging application has chatbots, and not everyone in messaging applications is using chatbots, but still, it's a big audience. When done well, satisfaction with them is quite high. So again, an interesting space. And when it comes to voice, again, this is the various platforms, the big, now I'm trying to remember what color represents what, but it doesn't really matter. You can see that in the past year, it's got a lot bigger. So again, a huge platform, especially in certain parts of the world, and especially in the English-speaking world. Actually, with Alexa, German is only the second language they've added, which is unusual, actually. German is not necessarily the second most popular language in the world, but anyway, that's where they decided to do it next. And Amazon especially are actually working very hard to try and get you to develop skills, as they call. They have bounty programs, they have workshops, they have sessions. They're even actually giving you money in some cases for developing skills. So certainly a good time to be looking into it. So for this presentation, I'm going to use an example of DocSpot, a sort of hypothetical chatbot and voice assistant that I've been slowly prototyping to sort of give people a way of interacting with documentation. Now, I appreciate this may not even make sense as a voice interface or a chatbot, but we'll see where and when that may or may not be applicable. But it's something we can work with, I suppose, and something we can understand how we can bring our expertise to this space. And I'm also underneath that going to be mostly using the Docker project as kind of the documentation we're interacting with. Again, I sort of use it in all my examples just because it's sufficiently large and complicated, but well known enough, etc., etc. So let's get started. Tip number 1 is designing for people. Now, putting a user first is not exactly a new statement for me to make in the tech space, but it's much more important with conversational interfaces. And you should definitely prototype your ideas as much as possible beforehand. And here is actually a great photo from the BBC when they're prototyping their Alexa skill. And so here, this person here is pretending to be Alexa, and these are the people using it. And they're having a conversation with the person to prototype it before they get to any code. And they can't see each other as well. This is also very important because it's a conversation with someone you can't see. So it's not like a normal conversation, whereas humans, we pick up a lot of subtleties from speaking to someone face to face. So you actually have to shield the person as well. Just give me 1 second. I really want to get my notes, and for some reason my mouse pointer has vanished off of either screen. Oh, here it is. Got it. Right, there we go. And then through this prototyping process, listen to these conversations and observe what people say to try and accomplish those tasks. And this will also help you understand if the use case doesn't even make sense to a conversational interface. If it seems kind of too difficult to figure out how to say something to accomplish a task, maybe it isn't a task suited to this type of interface, because there are a lot that don't. You don't really just want to directly replace traditional user interfaces. Like a common example is someone says, I'm just going to replicate a form with a conversational interface. But actually having a conversation where you are filling in a form, if you can imagine it, is pretty tedious. So a classic example of how this can be done better in a conversational interface is something like flight booking. When you go to a website and you want to book a flight, you have to pick to and from dates, you have to pick locations, you have to pick other preferences. But with a conversation, I can just say, I want to go to Sydney tomorrow. And you suddenly get a whole bunch of kind of metadata that you don't get through a form. And you can extract from that. So you have to sort of think through how you replace more traditional user interface processes. And equally, because these are online, we can harness a lot of other sort of data that we may know about a person. So let's try a conversation. I will welcome just shouting. So, you want to know, you're getting started with Docker, you want to ask DocSpot how to install and get started with Docker on your computer. So how would this conversation work? And think about, from the kind of design perspective, what are the keywords useful to listen for, and react to if you're kind of the interface. So, anyone got any ideas?
Install Docker Windows 7.
With?
Windows 7.
Yeah, okay. Anything else?
What's Docker?
Doesn't really, well actually, okay, no, maybe it does matter. All right, okay, good point. Let's put very, very simply, Docker is a way that developers can develop applications a lot quicker and more kind of safely on their machine. Let's just say that for now. That's enough detail for this. And it's available on multiple platforms. So so it's a developer tool. So any other ideas? This was already a good one, but...
Is your conversational interface running on the same machine, or is it on a different device?
Let's say in this case, because most of the time it's running either on your machine or on a device you have next to you.
It's important to ask because you wouldn't have to say what platform you're installing on.
Yes, this is a very good point. If it's running on this machine knows what it is. If it's running on an Alexa device, it doesn't necessarily know. So that's actually a very good point.
You could specify the release of Docker. So Docker has multiple releases, unstable or stable.
Yeah.
So install Docker stable.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, this is kind of why it's a completely different sort of design process, because you actually think about things you would say. And the interesting point with if it's on your machine or not, because you can say, hey DocSpot, I want to install Docker, and it instantly knows it's running on a Mac. So why show me how to install it on Windows or Linux, for example? So you start to get a lot of this other information as well, which we'll come back to later. But actually, this is the design process that a lot of people in this space kind of say do. Actually have conversations with each other and see where you get. So this leads very nicely into writing for ears, or eyes in cases of chatbots as well. And because it's still, actually I'm going to change this to write for conversation, because the way we have a conversation with each other is very different from actual traditional documentation. And for many writers, this is actually going to involve unlearning a lot of what you know already, because we've kind of honed our keyboard skills to produce the best written words, but we all kind of know and acknowledge that the spoken word, the conversation, is a completely different form, and actually not always the best way of communicating, and not always the best way of saying something. So one thing to bear in mind is that our words with conversational interfaces may not be the cleverest way, may not be the best way, may not be the smartest way of saying something, but we have to make sure that we write for what is the most natural and effective way for the conversational medium. And there's lots of, this is my little picture here, and there's actually lots of differences between the ways that, especially our ears and eyes, like to consume words. And this is actually, when this was pointed out to me, I picked up some of these tips from one of the Amazon developer relations people, and he has a very good presentation that goes into a bit more detail on this, that eyes actually expect uniformity. We kind of like things to be even and nicely laid out, and we like templates. We like to know that a heading is always going to be here, and etc., etc. But ears actually like variety. A conversation that is always the same every time isn't actually a very good conversation. Think about those times when you've interacted with like an old sort of voice interface, like a phone system, or an unhelpful person who just keeps repeating the same thing back at you. It's actually really annoying. So think about this when you are creating conversational UIs. You actually need to have some variety and different ways of saying the same thing. So finding the perfect sentence is actually no longer enough. You need to find the perfect half dozen sentences. And also the perfect half dozen sentences that someone might say to try and get an answer as well. So let's try for exercise 2. Let's try, I'd like to hear different suggestions for responses to I don't understand. Say, say we've gone back to our previous example. We've asked DocSpot how to install Docker. And, well, let's start with one example. For some reason you're using DocSpot and you don't know what Docker is. And how could you respond to that? Instead of I don't understand, what could be a response to that?
Is it me responding or is it DocSpot?
You as DocSpot.
Me as DocSpot.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what you said. Could you repeat that?
It's one, yeah. Say, for example, you said Windows 7. Windows 7 is considered unsupported, so it's not been programmed in, so it doesn't understand it. What could be a good response to that?
So it doesn't understand it at all, not even as an unsupported platform?
It might have understood the Windows part, maybe. But what could be a way of expressing kind of its partial understanding in a constructive way?
Would you like to install on Windows?
Okay, yeah. And maybe just a couple of random alternatives to saying, I don't understand. Give me like half a dozen, if we can, different ways you can say, I don't understand. Just shout them out.
Please repeat.
Okay?
I didn't catch
Okay.
I don't know about that.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So, once you start to think like a human again, this is the interesting thing with this space. You actually get to think more like a human again. You actually start to realize there's lots of ways we can say things, and a good interface will have a bit of variety. And actually, the presentation I kind of borrowed a lot from this. He had a higher and lower game, and it would keep saying higher, 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 and it just gets really, really annoying, very, very quickly. Okay, so the next one is making instructions clear. And this is especially interesting in conversations because we as humans tend to make probably hundreds of assumptions every day based on kind of contextual information that we received. But these contexts can be very culturally biased. They may not always be clear to other people. They can be based on all sorts of assumptions that we have that other people don't. So when you design a conversational interface, you need to think about the same thing. And we need to be as clear as possible as to when a user is expected to make an interaction. Don't hide the interactions in assumptions, and make sure you directly ask questions that keep the conversation kind of flowing as you do. I picked a picture here that I don't know if entirely makes sense, but it was my only way I could find something about keeping instructions clear. I don't know. I couldn't find that many unoffensive images, to be honest with you. So this is where possibly the example of DocSpot starts to break down a bit, because it's not much of a conversation, really. But so, for example, when the interface is communicating back with you, it needs to be clear when that is an option for a user to jump in and take it as an option. It could be audio hints, it could be chunking the conversation, it could be a couple of different ways. So let's try another quick example where we will present a series of next steps after a getting started guide. So how could we let the user know what they could select without being annoying to someone? So say, for example, we've installed Docker, and just as an example in this case, without knowing too much about the detail, next steps could be learning to make a cluster, adding images, starting a container, Docker swarm, and maybe about 6 sort of next steps. How could we replicate like a menu or a sort of next steps list in a conversation?
Would you like me to help you get started?
Yeah. Yeah.
Ask what they were hoping to do.
Yeah. This is a good one. You don't present the user with options. You actually ask them what they're trying to accomplish.
And if I say, I don't know, then you've got your menu ready.
Maybe, yeah. And there was an idea here.
You prompt them with the most common next thing.
Yeah. Any other ideas?
Lump it into some categories so you can offer an A or B.
Yep.
You want to do this kind of thing or that kind of thing.
Yep.
And then follow up with
Yep.
a small set of menu
Yep.
options.
Sure. And there was another idea at the back there, I think.
Oh, just what do you want to do next?
Yeah.
What other users are asking? Something like that. So
Yeah.
maybe
Yeah.
someone's asked a similar
Yeah.
question before.
Yeah. We have found that people who install Docker on Mac tend to want to know this next. Something like that. Yeah. And this leads very nicely into kind of the next point, that you can use information wisely. The interesting thing here, so if you have a conversation with a human and they repeatedly, and I am guilty of this, forget or ignore something you've already told them, it's also incredibly frustrating. And it's similar with conversational interfaces. And the good thing with computers is, despite their faults, they're quite good at remembering the information. That's kind of what they're best at. So we can remember a lot of the information we're being told along the way and then use it to our advantage. So another example here is we can also use it to skip unnecessary steps. I think one thing, whilst we know, as especially technical writers online, that we don't expect people to read documentation from start to finish, we kind of present it sometimes in a series of steps that we would like people to follow. But we have to sort of think a bit more here in this use case that steps are not always so linear. And we may, if someone has already told us they've done something, we don't necessarily need to present those steps anymore. Or we don't have to present them directly. or we can change information based on the information received, as we already talked about, different operating systems and things like that. So here's actually one of my little prototypes of a chatbot. Hopefully it's going to play. There we go. Oh, I think it just played too quickly. But, so this was, maybe it'll go, will it loop? Yes. So I want to get started with Docker. Sure, I can help with that. Would you like to know more about how Docker works? Let's do something else. I'm running Linux. So it jumps to Linux, and then our next step. So this is kind of doing a lot of what we've said already. Yeah, you get the point. But, so using what you already know that the person has told you is very important. And we have actually, the other advantage with these is a lot of these services are running in kind of cloud environments with lots of access to processing power that we can use to our advantage. So I think the interesting thing here is you start to realize, once you start to think about it, it's actually moderately simple to begin with, because it's, again, just thinking how we talk almost in everyday life. But let's try a quick exercise where I'll state something, and I'm going to give you some information, and I'd like to see what you could do with it in a response. So, as a hint, for those of you who don't know, if you're using something called Docker Swarm, you've probably already completed the first steps. And another hint, 1604 is a version of Ubuntu Linux. So, conversations are vague. This is what we mean. So, hey DocSpot, how do I set up Swarm on 1604? What can we parse? I've almost given you the answers anyway, but what can we parse out of that question?
Which of the three swarms?
Yeah. Oh, which of the three swarms? Okay.
Three different similarly named concepts.
Yeah. Okay. This is a good point already. Yeah.
We can assume they've got Docker
Yeah.
and they're on Linux.
And the particular version as well. Yeah. Okay. And we also now know those things for future reference as well, if they hit any problems further down the line. Most conversation interfaces will retain a state of the conversation for at least the conversation. Some of the more advanced ones will retain it in between conversations as well, and it's kind of up to you what you want to do. The next one is keep it short. Again, this is not a new statement, especially in the world of online writing. We are used to the short attention spans of people in the online world. And a lot of us have got used to already tailoring our writing to be as efficient as possible in conveying a point. And this actually applies more so in conversational interfaces. We actually have even short attention spans with our ears than our eyes. So we have to keep information very succinct without sounding rude, which is also possible. And this is, I think, one of the nice old images from The Simpsons, which, I don't know, it was hard finding funny images that suited this talk, but it's true. Stories that go on and on and on for a long time, we will switch off. So that, bear it in mind. I have been using DocSpot as an example, but could it even work? Do users want to hear 500 words spoken by a machine? Probably not. And there's no wrong or right answer here. I'm actually just interested to hear, do you think you could, with a chatbot or a voice interface, have a kind of documentation assistant? What would be ways you could do it? And one hint I will give you as well, for anyone who's not used a voice interface before, is often they come with companion applications. So you can sometimes have a visual component if you want. So could there be ways of having a conversational interface on documentation, or is it just a stupid example that I've decided to use? Any ideas?
I'm thinking about IKEA documentation.
Yeah, there's different sorts of documentation, of course, as well. Yeah.
Yeah, but when
Yeah.
I'm building something, I often look at step 6, maybe 11 times while I'm
Yeah.
doing step 6. And so if you could make DocSpot say that same thing again and again and again without getting irritated and without me having to drop what I'm doing and make it do it again,
Yeah.
that would be valuable.
Yeah.
So
And
if it could tell me, put the screw in the end and then put it in.
I mostly come from the software world, so that's what I think. But of course, there are probably writers in this room writing for all sorts of documentation where it may make more or less sense. Does anyone? Yeah. Okay.
I was thinking of IKEA too, but thinking of their old Anna assistant
Yeah.
website. so work similarly, but what I'm wondering for documentation specifically is, do you want it to give you the whole process verbally, or do you want it to sort of be an easy interaction and then have it point you to something else?
Yeah. I also feel this is a point in that I actually feel in the very near future we will have these devices as kind of omnipresent beings, and we'll be so used to just asking them for things and it'll connect up to our computer or something like that, that it's almost be a replacement for Googling, hey DocSpot, how do I install Docker? And then something opens up on your computer instead of going to Google and doing it, which sounds kind of dumb, but I'm sure things we do now also felt dumb 10 years ago. So yeah.
I've done some work with an accessibility consultant, looking at how they can use our interface for vision impaired people, where their entire experience with anything on the web is in fact entirely auditory.
Exactly. Yeah.
And she uses apps that streams information to her. She can tell it how fast to go. She can say pause. She can say, repeat 10 seconds, that sort of thing. So she can actually jump around, and you can embed meta information in your documentation to help the auditory component. So it is entirely possible, and in fact there are a segment of the population that do in fact consume user manuals entirely through their ears. So there are ways, in our tooling that is available already that supports this, and integrating it with a tool so that the rest of us, make use of that in the right circumstances would help us and them, I think.
And especially for long form audio, not everything has to be computer generated. There's actually a lot of interactive fiction skills in the Alexa world, especially, that are read by a human. It's not as dynamic, of course, because it's been pre-recorded, but it is possible. That's a whole other conversation, but yeah. Yeah.
I was thinking, I might have both my hands full.
Yeah.
So I might be maintaining my motorbike, and I might say, okay, now I've got my hand on this gadget, and I've got the tool in this hand. Tell me what to do next.
Yeah.
And like you were saying, it could interact with an app that shows me graphically.
Yeah.
But at least I'm able to
Yeah.
talk to it.
This sort of, actually, where we cross over here a bit is into the world of kind of augmented reality apps and things like that. And there's a company, especially who I just did an interview with, called ThingWorks, who create a lot of these platforms, and they're especially used in industry. And the ability to then interact with those in an audio way as well is, it's actually more safe as well, more than accessibility and having your hands free and things like that. So there's actually, once you start to think a bit deeper, you start to realise where there's a lot more of these use cases. Was that a hand? Yeah.
I think it's really exciting to think about, you can talk about how currently we're sort of looking at, this sort of being an information provider, but the idea, going forward of having these things, not just reading instructions to you, but
Actually tasks bringing up, especially in the Docker case, for example, if you were trying to run Docker on AWS, for example, you've basically got a series of web services interacting with each other, and that's possible. It starts to get a bit concerning, because what are we doing? But anyway, but yeah, actually, and this is one of the interesting things with this whole area, and even with my kind of more traditional documentation, I try to make it as interactive as possible, because we can do it, actually. It's quite possible to do this sort of stuff. So, yeah, I was about to ask, it's fine. I'm nearly done. So, the thing to bear in mind here, I've stood up here and kind of given you some ideas. I am not an expert in this space at all. I've done very little work in it. It just interests me a lot. And I'm actually about to maybe start doing some work in it in the next couple of weeks, and then maybe I might be more of an expert. But conversational interfaces are in their early days, and no one is really an expert yet, not at all. In fact, in using them or creating them. So it's a space where it's kind of open to people to become the experts in some ways. The interesting thing as well, when it comes to building these, a lot of the commercial platforms especially are all built on top of cloud platforms. So you actually have very, very dynamic access to logging information as well. When we're doing our written documentation, a lot of the time we don't really know if people have understood something. But with a conversation interface, if someone has said something 5 times and they haven't got anywhere, we know that. And we can figure out, we can actually hear what they said or read what they said in the kind of log files. So actually, in some respects, it's harder to get started, but we get a lot more information about what people are struggling to do. So it's interesting. So if you're interested in the space, I strongly suggest you just have an experiment, because no one is an expert yet. It's kind of green fields. Thanks for having me. This is my various details, and I'll be around tonight if anyone wants to have a conversation about conversations. Thank you.